Sometimes he's a thunder-breathing, overpowered, demon-slaying nightmare, and other times he's an annoying coward. But this is how I made my 3D version of Zenitsu. Just like we did with Inosuke, we'll begin with Plus.ai. I went through all the same steps as last time, so if you guys want to see it in detail, check out the Inosuke video, link should be above. I find this a lot more enjoyable because we can get posing out of the way. It can feel dynamic, and it's me posing, so you know, it feels a little bit more unique. I wasn't 100% sure on what I wanted to do. I had a few concepts in mind that I really liked, and Thunderclap and Flash was one of my main inspirations, but of course as an artist I wanted to put my own little spin on it as well. The first thing I wanted to properly tackle was the hair. So I jumped into Zbrush, blocked out a face, and then went back into Blender so I could begin experimenting with different styles. My main goal was to keep the same distinctive silhouette that they have in the anime, so I used these curves, but I wanted a little bit more detail, so I do that through shading later on. I'm just going to do a quick breakdown of the hair. I'm going to load in a Bezier curve, move that out. We're going to imagine that the cube is our head, so I'm just going to rotate that. This is our little strand of hair. The next step is to go in your curve settings. We're going to go to geometry. Now I'm going to add depth to this, and I'm going to extrude it as well. So this is the major part of our hair. Let's fill caps as well, just to make sure these caps are closed off. If I press tab, go into edit mode, I'm just going to move this out, and I'm going to press A, select all, and let's subdivide this quickly. Alt S is to scale the hair, and I use Control T a lot to tilt the hair as well. Another thing is when we're in edit mode, that's the best time to duplicate your curve if it's for the same clump of hair. So all you have to do is press A, Shift D, and now I can have a separate strand, right? Maybe you'll need to go back in and use Control T again to rotate these to correct any mistakes. But that's the major workflow part of the hair. Apart from this, it's just lots of time and lots of effort. Now I have a head I'm happy enough with, I can begin the rest of the character. The jacket's my main priority at first because it frames the character from the front so much, but I quickly move on to everything else. Dynamesh it all together, begin blocking out the shapes, and I put colors because that helps you visualize everything as well. I'll usually tackle two big pieces, for example the jacket and the trousers, and then once I'm happy with that style, I'll propagate that to everything else on the character. And here's an example of an early block out versus the final finished model. For shading, I wanted to keep things overall recognizable, but add some more details than you'd get in the 2D representation of Zenitsu. So with the hair, I use a simple gradient as the diffuse. Then I just use a noise texture, remap that, and use that to drive the height, which is the normal information, so that's these little streaks running along it, and I use that to drive the specular. Now, when it comes to the anisotropy, without this, the hair would look really flat, so you can see how it looks there, but with the anisotropic, that uses the angles to define where we can and can't see the specularity. For the face, you can see the diffuse hair. This was just painted in Substance Painter. And then we have the roughness. I didn't use the ambient occlusion or metalness. And then we have a normal map. The normal map's mainly just driving these small little streaks on the lips that you can't even see, to be honest. But again, if I do a high-res render, then maybe you will. Now for the jacket, same deal as the head. So I just dropped this into Substance Painter, and these are the textures for it. So again, the main reason why I even went into Substance for the jacket is so I could add the little triangles with just an easy tile that I could control where I wanted it and where I didn't. I added that. We added the displacement, which is just from Zbrush. All of this stuff has displacement from Zbrush, and again the normal map from Substance with the tiling detail there. And then what's this one? This is just the roughness again. So everything else is pretty much shaded in the same way. For all of the movement, like always, I experimented. I started off doing physics simulations, you know, I played with wind, I played with all different types of things, but because of how dense I'm working, because I'm trying to just work fast for personal work, it was too heavy. So what I decided on was using displacement to drive everything. I really like this because it's fast, you can see I can move around the viewport, so it's cheap and it's really easy to art direct. To get all of this to work, I'm using a low res version of the meshes that I already have. So I'm just going to go back to frame 1 and let's turn off the displacement on this. So you can see here, all I did is duplicate, inflated this, and then decimated it. So I just had a low res representation of the areas I wanted to move. Then I'm using a displacement to drive this mesh. And I have this high poly jacket mesh bound to the low poly jacket mesh with a mesh deform. To control the displacement happening on this object, I'm using this empty. On the actual geometry, you can see that I have the coordinate set to object and I have the object set to that empty. To drive that empty, I'm using a simple expression. So I'm just going to delete the driver for now and I'll just show you guys. So all you have to do is write hash frame, and then for now just leave it as default so you can see what happens. So for each frame it's going to generate a different value. That's all that does. But if you want to control the speed, we can do that very easily. So my default, you'll just put divide by 9 is my default. That's where I liked it. But you could easily go in and say I want this to be super slow and do 100. And now you can see the movement is extremely slow. You can see that this also affects the grass. The only difference is rather than having a mesh bind, because the grass is a lot less dense, I just have that displacement hooked up to the grass, and then I have the same empty driving this as well. So everything would be uniform, making it feel like the wind's moving in the scene. And of course you could go around, move this around as well. You could go on the low poly mesh and you could tweak the strength to your liking. And you can of course go on the textures and you can tweak all of these values as well. The other thing I liked about this was, you know, I don't need to have self collision or anything like that on. It doesn't collide with itself as long as your mesh is big enough and your displacement is big enough. You can run into issues, but just avoiding that fixes a huge amount of it. For the visual effects in the scene, I use a few add-ons. I use the real-time flame generator. The only thing I tweak there is the alpha, so it comes in more seamlessly. And I use the draw lightning generators, which use these curves to generate lightning. Now we'll look at the final lighting, but firstly on screen you'll notice that the smoke simulation has loads of jagged edges. This isn't in the final render because I'm using motion blur. I do that mainly to avoid smoke simulations and I like the look. Now we're in our scene with just our HDRI. I began with one for this project because I didn't have a clear idea in mind for lighting. Quick tip, you can move lights around by pressing Shift T and pointing anywhere on your model. Now I'm going to activate our sunlight, which I'm using as my scene's main rim light. I also added a face rim light to add some separation between the shoulder and the face. Now we have the face key light. The thing worth mentioning here is that I'm using a mask to control the shadow underneath the eye. You can see that mask on the bottom right of the screen, and I've just muted it so you can see the coverage the key light would get without that. Next up is the light blocker and the left fill light. You can see the subtle rim light that adds to the smoke on the left hand side. The light blocker in the scene is just this plane in the sky. I cut faces out and move them around to get the results I want, and with fog, this can give some really nice effects. Now we have the front fill light to reduce the contrast in that area and make sure everything's visible. The face fill light's really subtle, but it's just to make sure again that area doesn't get too dark. And here's a before and after just so you can see the difference. Now we have a fill light for the clothes so we can see the folds and highlight the details underneath. Everything still felt a little too dark, so I added that ambient fill light to brighten the overall image. And finally I added some point lights for the lightning, so anywhere it interacted there'd be a little bit of a glow there. We're now officially done in 3D, so I'm going to take you through the final step in Photoshop and show you how I layer up to get the final look. So we now have our base layer in Blender. The first layer we're going to add is a darken to make sure that the interest is on the character. I used the body glow to get rid of some of that 3D rendered look and make it look a little bit softer. This is just a light effect around the fingers, so we have some type of interaction with the lighting. I have this effects glow as well, which is just making sure the edge of the screen has some interest. The lightning looked way too clean and clinical, so I wanted to add something. These were just brush strokes with a few filters over the top of them. This one's a really subtle layer, but if you look in the middle of the lightning, you'll see that this is where it's appearing, just to make things feel a little bit hotter, a little bit more intense. These glow layers are around the head, again just to bring the focus more to that area. Then we have an overall glow, so we don't just have a lot of empty space. I then brightened the hair because I felt like it was too dark. The skin as well, it felt a little bit too muted, so I added some saturation there. This cleanup layer does a lot of small things, but a lot nonetheless. You can see that on the neck, I clean up that dot that was there, it's just an intersection. On the hair, I darken a few elements. I fixed the mouth to look more like the anime. I just prefer the look, and I added a black ring around the eye. After looking at some references, I noticed that that should probably be something I had. Next, I merged all of these layers, and then I just did a camera raw filter. The main things I added here was the grain, and then you can see that I bumped up the saturation and I added a little bit of contrast to the image. I added some chromatic aberration in spots as well. Nothing crazy, I can't even see where it's on right now, but it's just something that could add a nice touch, especially when zoomed in. We went with even more of a vignette over that edge, again just to make sure our focus stays on Zenitsu. And then I have some dust kicking up where the light's most intense. I just wanted to add some specks, some type of sharpness, that again you can zoom in and see. The alternate eyes are my final layer. I had to go in and add this as well. I am a fan of that look, but I thought I may as well just do that afterwards and do the eyes inside of Blender so I have the options. Now, that's all the steps complete. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy these final renders.
Are you ready?